Welcome to Prescribing Prosperity with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos from MedWealth Financial Services, operating through IPC Securities Corporation. In this podcast, we provide unique insights into wealth management, the psychology of financial decisions, and help listeners place the capital markets into perspective. Our aim is to help physicians, business owners, and other medical professionals to live their dream. Life is to live and enjoy, so we'll also cover health and lifestyle-related topics such as food, dining, travel, and unique experiences. Learn how global trends shape our investment strategy as we help you assemble your roadmap to prosperity.
Guys, I'm especially excited about your conversation today. You were talking about the generic drug manufacturing industry, and you couldn't have a more perfect guest. Your guest is Katherine Eban. She is an award-winning investigative journalist, a best-selling author. She is a special correspondent to Vanity Fair, and she is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her articles on pharmaceutical counterfeiting, gun trafficking, coercive interrogation by the CIA, and COVID's origins have won international attention and numerous awards. It is her second book, though, that we are focusing on today. That is Bottle of Lies, the inside story of the generic drug boom, and it was a New York Times bestseller and one of New York Times 100 notable books of 2019. So, without further ado, let us introduce Katherine Eban. Katherine, welcome. I hope you're doing well. Nice to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Catherine, you came to my attention while listening to Peter Attia's The Drive podcast. Shout out there. Peter Attia is a fellow Canadian. In fact, he's a fellow Torontonian as we are. And he has a great podcast. So that's when you first came to my attention, Catherine. I have a particular interest in health matters for selfish reasons. And I found the subject matter fascinating. After listening to the podcast, I went out, purchased your book. And over the course of a very long airplane trip, I read your book over 5 hours to and 5 hours back, and then I had a little bit left over when I got back home. The book is unbelievable. And what's interesting is I seem to recall that Peter in his podcast said that it made him angry, and that's exactly how I felt while I was reading the book. I was getting angry. I was getting angry at the system that is in place for the introduction of pharmaceuticals and generic pharmaceuticals. I was getting angry at the oversight or lack thereof by the FDA. And I'll tell you though, as I was reading the book, I could not put it down. It was extraordinarily engaging. It was never mind engaging. It was absolutely riveting. And you are an incredible storyteller, and I know this is a true story, but you're an incredible storyteller, and I really enjoyed reading your book, and I've recommended it to many, many people. And everyone listening to this podcast today, I recommend you go out and you purchase Bottle of Lies by Katherine Eban as soon as you're done listening to our podcast, because it has incredible insights into what is going on in our world. And as we all know, pretty much everyone over the age of 40 is on some type of medication. And it is important to understand where these things are sourced and the implications. Katherine, for those who have not read your book, can you give a brief synopsis of your investigation, what was involved and what was uncovered before you get into the whole story?
Yeah, so the brief synopsis is that the story is based on a 10-year investigation that I did into the global generic drug industry. The investigation took me to 4 continents. I spent time reporting in India and in China. I was able to expose the way in which global generic drug companies that we all depend on, we all take their products, routinely fake their quality data in order to accelerate approvals by regulators around the world. They do this as a kind of cat and mouse game with regulators and inspectors who show up. They deceive them in multiple ways. And the end result is that the drugs we're all taking, which we are told by our respective regulators are essentially identical to the brand name drugs, are not. They haven't been tested properly. They may have different shelf lives. They may have different excipient or additional ingredients. They may not have the same stability. They may not have the same dissolution rate. And so this is really a book for anybody who wants a very intense global crime story, but also anybody who has ever taken a generic medication and thought, you know what? I'm not sure if it's the same as my brand name. I don't feel the same when I take it, or it doesn't appear to be working in the same way, or I was stable on a brand name drug or a different generic, and now I am unstable. Yeah.
Since you mentioned that, that reminds me of an anecdote with my late mother. She was very ill in the final 5 years of her life, and she was on all sorts of medications. And one day I was there, and she said, "Would you go to the pharmacy and get me my medication?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "Make sure they give me the good drugs." I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "I know there are cheap drugs, and I know there are expensive drugs." Now, my mom is someone who never received a formal education due to the Second World War. And she was obviously did not have advanced knowledge of a lot of things, but she knew that she didn't feel right when her medication was changed from brand name to generic. She felt the difference, and I found it fascinating. And at the time, not knowing what I've learned since then, I dismissed her concern, saying, no, the generics are the same as brand name. It's the same stuff. It's just less expensive. And clearly your book shed light on that, and I was definitely wrong in saying that to my mom. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I mean, I will say that, since the book came out, I've had many pharmacists come up to me and say that they felt incredible guilt after reading my book, because they had many patients and customers who raised those concerns with them, and they reassured them or dismissed their concerns by just saying, no, it's the same as, what you told your mother. So there's no reason that consumers should know, because our regulators tell us they're the same, right? But in fact, I actually was able to prove through a 10-year investigation that they are not the same.
I think what also contributes to that is what I came to learn through this book is the misconception that, and I shared this misconception. My understanding was always that generic drugs were essentially the same formula. The patent was then shared with the generic manufacturers, but because they don't have to incur the same R&D expenditure, they can produce the exact same drug at a fraction of the cost. When in fact, even though the patents may expire, the companies who found the patents or come up with the initial research actively go out of their way to prevent that information from being sharing. And so a lot are being prevented from being shared, excuse me. And so what ends up happening is the companies have to reverse engineer what they believe the formula is. And obviously it can't be the exact same formula. They have to change some components of it in order to not infringe upon the patents. And so it creates the opportunity for different effects. And I had no idea. And I don't think a lot of people did understand or do understand that is the case. I think a lot of us operate under that veil of confusion as to how generic drugs are founded. And so I think it was great the way that you were able to expose that and provide such tremendous insight.
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly right.
Now, Katherine, is this issue with quality also applicable to over-the-counter drugs?
Oh, in a huge way. And in fact, it's
Really?
quite a bit worse, because over-the-counter drugs are much less regulated than prescription drugs. So when you take an over-the-counter drug, you may be swallowing an aspirin that was made in Hyderabad at a plant where an FDA inspector has never set foot. Worse yet, many of the drugstore chains, and in the US, obviously you've got somewhat different chains, but in the US, CVS, Duane Reade, Rite Aid, they all have drugstore brands.
Right. As we do here. Yeah.
And they contract with some of the lowest cost Indian and Chinese manufacturers to produce that. And usually those contracts provide for audits by the drugstore brands that allow the manufacturers to get months of advance notice when they're going to be audited. So the drugstore chain auditors show up at a sort of stage set of compliance, right? Into a manufacturing plant that's been completely cleaned up. But I have photographs of some of those plants in their native state, and they are ghastly. I mean, you wouldn't want to set foot in these plants, let alone swallow a pill that had been made there. So unfortunately, and this has been going on now in the US, where there are these eye drops that are supposed to be sterile over-the-counter eye drops that have been manufactured in India, and we have patients going blind from taking those.
That's awful.
In numerous states, and there's a vast recall underway as we speak.
This by the way, while you're recounting this information, I'm getting angry again the way I did when I was reading the book. This brings light to the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, and their role in all of this. And so perhaps you can give us some background on who the FDA are, how they began, and what their role was in this particular story.
First, let me say that the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., it's the world's sort of preeminent food and drug regulator. It is the gold standard. In fact, so many countries rely on the judgments of the Food and Drug Administration that whatever they say goes. Most countries don't have the budgets to send their own investigators into plants. So basically, they're looking to the FDA to sign off on manufacturing plants. Basically, the concept behind the FDA is that it is responsible for the safety and effectiveness of what amounts to about a quarter of the U.S. economy. Anything we swallow, any food or medicine we give to our pets, any medical devices, even cosmetics are regulated under the food and drug regulations that govern the activities of the FDA. And the FDA was born out of, the expression is that, drug regulation is built on dead bodies. And that is true. Like, Congress essentially does not give the FDA authority until there are disasters.
Right.
And the FDA was born out of many, many consumer disasters in which there is, lead and arsenic in pharmaceuticals and toxins in makeup that cause blindness. And I mean,
Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, a trailblazer for someone like yourself, comes to mind as, uncovering some of the true issues that existed within the meat packing industry specifically, but also in food production in general back in the turn of the century in the early 1900s.
There are true horrors that the FDA has averted. On the other hand, they are an imperfect agency. They are not sufficiently empowered by Congress to do everything they need to do. They are fighting for their budget and survival all the time. And so, there is this constant tension between the FDA trying to sort of convince and cajole and encourage industry to improve its standards, partnering with industry to pull up its socks and do better, and the need to investigate and punish bad actors.
So early on in the history of the FDA, and I think it was in the early 60s, late 50s, there was a huge success on thalidomide. Perhaps you can expand on that.
Yeah. Francis Kelsey, who is Canadian originally, was a drug reviewer for the FDA. And a file related to a drug called thalidomide landed on her desk. Thalidomide was being presented as a treatment for morning sickness in pregnant and sort of a miracle remedy. And it was already being taken in Europe and in parts around the world. And Kelsey was suspicious of the application. She felt they didn't explain the efficacy of it clearly enough. The evidence that it was safe seemed thin to her, and she started demanding more information from the company. And the company was enraged, tried to go around her, tried to undermine her with her bosses. But in fact, her judgment that there was a lack of safety data related to this drug held. And the drug was never approved in the US.
The irony is that it was permitted in Canada, Francis Kelsey's home country, and she helped protect Americans, but there was no one in Canada to protect Canadians, and there was hundreds of people who were affected.
So what is interesting about the thalidomide crisis is that some thalidomide was distributed in the US, a limited amount, because it was given as doctor samples. Those doctors distributed it to their patients. But needless to say, it was far more limited in its distribution because it was never approved by the FDA. And that is like a shining example of why we need an empowered regulator.
And that's a great illustration of a huge win for the FDA early in its life.
Yeah.
Do you know, Katherine, by chance, how many drugs are initially approved and then later pulled off the market at the FDA?
Yeah, no, I don't have that answer. I mean, I will say this, which is once a drug gets approval and it's out of the starting gates, it is quite hard to pull a drug back. And, you know, one of the things that the FDA really likes to avoid is litigation with companies. Now, that said, it's involved in endless litigation, but, you know, once a drug is out, any effort to restrict its use, to put a black box warning on it, that can be very, very challenging. So really, it's the approval is a critical moment.
Well, Katherine, before we get into the history of generic drugs themselves, I hope you'll permit me just to take a step back and ask you, how did you get involved as an investigative journalist? You know, how did you get your start in that field of work?
I'm a totally accidental journalist. It's a long story, but I'll try to make it short, which was I was at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and I was studying Paradise Lost. In fact, I have a master's degree in 17th century epic poetry.
Wow.
And while I was at Oxford, I got a call from an alumnus at my college, which was Brown, and he said, "How would you like to go to Europe, figure out how they take care of their elderly, and don't come back with a $30,000 bill?" So that was being held out to me as a summer job. I was like, God, have you got the wrong person? I know nothing about healthcare. I know, nothing about reporting anything. I'm a creative writer studying poetry. But I spent a summer in Swedish nursing homes, wrote up a report, came back to the US after my studies, and was trying to just get a job to support my fiction writing. And my resume circulated, and I got a call from the public advocate of New York City, Mark Green. He needed to hire a healthcare policy analyst. So I had this summer job on my resume. He hired me, and I began investigating New York City hospitals. And it turned out I was really good at it. So I was writing up these reports that were getting onto the front page of the New York Times. And then at a certain moment, the head of Bellevue Medical Center, who knew I was a writer, said, "Hey, if you want to write anything about Bellevue, we'll open the place up to you. You can, have the run of the place. You could sit in meetings." I was like, great. So I didn't know
Wow.
anything about journalism. And I pitched it as a story to the New York Times Magazine. They said yes, but I was employed part-time at Mark Green's office at that time. So he was a Democrat, and the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, was a Republican. So the Giuliani administration got wind of the fact that somebody who worked for a Democratic politician's office was going to be writing a story about the city's hospitals for the Times. And they forced the Times to give me an ultimatum. If you want to continue writing this article, you got to quit your job. So I was like, okay. I quit my job and I spent about 8 months in the Bellevue emergency room. I was on the trauma pager. I would go in for major accidents.
Wow.
And I spent 8 months in the ER and wrote this article for the New York Times Magazine. And that's how I became a healthcare journalist.
Wow, what a story. And that's
Yeah.
a baptism by fire.
Yeah.
No
So
kidding.
I like to say that I know more about Paradise Lost than any healthcare journalist working today. That is true.
Now,
I,
you don't have any background in chemistry, yet you're
None.
rhyming off all of this stuff in your book about these various drugs and how they work and all that. How did that come about? How did you learn all of that?
So I didn't do very well in high school chemistry, which was the last time I darkened a laboratory, and well, before I became a journalist. But the essential work of a journalist is to be a student who learns how things work.
right.
So, I was in my office in Brooklyn watching, YouTube videos on generic drug manufacturing, and I toured laboratories and I developed sources. I, spent a lot of time in manufacturing plants. So you educate yourself.
Very
And
impressive.
thank you. So yeah, I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a doctor. I have no medical training. I have very little scientific training. Yeah.
Excellent. So, and that is truly impressive, Catherine, that you're able to be so eloquently self-taught and so knowledgeable on a subject that you were largely unfamiliar with prior to you to starting your career. But to take this back to the story that we're covering today, how and why did generic drugs get their start? Can you tell us a little bit about the Hatch-Waxman Act and how that was basically a catalyst for the evolution of the generic drug industry within North America, but then obviously across the world?
So when branded drugs come on the market, those manufacturers have done extensive clinical trials with hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers, and done extensive testing, often over decades. It costs millions and millions to launch a new drug. So in the 1980s, late 1970s, there were, many branded drugs that had gone off patent. But the problem was that for generic drug makers, there was no unique pathway within the FDA for bringing those drugs to market. In other words, the requirements remained the same: clinical trials with hundreds of volunteers, endless paperwork, millions and millions of dollars in investment. So there became an awareness that there should be a unique, truncated pathway at the FDA for bringing a generic drug to market. So that's what the Hatch-Waxman Act did, was it developed this unique pathway for approval of a generic drug. Had to be the same molecule, taken by the same route of administration. So generic, brand name pill, you had to have a generic pill, or if it's an injection, it had to be an injection. But you could do safety and effectiveness testing on a much smaller group of clinical volunteers. You had much fewer paperwork demands, but you had to take certain essential steps.
Mhm.
certain kinds of testing, stability testing, and then you had to prove that your drug had roughly the same absorption into the bloodstream as the brand name drug, but it was much easier, much cheaper, and much faster. So that is what the Hatch-Waxman Act provided for. But the Hatch-Waxman Act did one other thing that is very important in the story of Bottle of Lies. So generic drug makers were saying to legislators, look, if I have to bring a generic drug to market, I'm likely going to be sued by the branded drug maker. I'm going to face an uncertain result at the FDA. So I have all these upfront costs. I have these legal battles. I might not be approved by the FDA. So what do I get if I bring a generic drug to market and I succeed? The Hatch-Waxman Act created something called first to file.
Mhm.
If a generic drug maker was the first to put down its application and succeeded in being first to market, it got 6 months of exclusivity on the US market at roughly 80% of the brand name price. After those 6 months, generic competitors could jump in, the price would drop significantly, but those 6 months were the windfall. They were the bonanza that everybody in the industry started chasing. So just as a for instance, generic Lipitor. It was an Indian company called Ranbaxy, which I know we'll talk a lot more about, which
Mhm.
won the first to file for generic Lipitor. As a result of that, it was worth about 6 months was worth about $600 million in sales. In fact, they made 100 million in the first 20, I think it was 100 million in the first 24 hours
My goodness.
Wow.
through advanced sales.
Wow.
So that is real money,
Yeah. Major incentive to
major incentive.
obviously be the first to file. And reading your description of it, all of these drug executives camped out in front of the FDA for almost 2 weeks on end, just waiting to get in and go. And it reminds me of Christmas Eve or Boxing Day, at Best Buy or something, when they're releasing the latest electronic and you get people camping out there for days and days hoping to get one of the limited supply that they have in stock. And to think about that for people who are high up in these drug manufacturing companies is absolutely mind-boggling. And so I think this is a great place to start. So tell us, how does the story begin? Tell us a little bit about who Ranbaxy is, who you just obviously brought up, and what transpired at the company, and who were some of the key players who featured prominently in the story.
Well, if I may, let's take it back to how I first started investigating this,
Sure.
because that will allow me to unfold the story of Ranbaxy
Okay.
in a way that's easy to follow. So it was 2008, and I got a call. At that point, I was well known as an investigative healthcare journalist. And I got a call from a guy named Joe Graydon, who had an NPR radio program called The People's Pharmacy. And he said to me, I am getting flooded with complaints from my listeners about their generic drugs. I'm getting these complaints that the drugs don't work or they have side effects. There's all these problems. And then he said that he had taken those complaints to the FDA, and officials there had told him, it was probably psychosomatic. If patients' drugs don't work, it's because the drug maybe changed color or shape. And so they think there's something wrong with it, even though there isn't. So Joe Graydon did not believe that. And he put this question to me. He said, what is wrong with the drugs? So I was like, yeah, what's wrong with the drugs? What an interesting question. Like, how hard could that be to figure out? That was, 10 years later, I was like, okay.
Wow.
That's quite the
So,
wormhole to go down.
yeah. So I start investigating, and pretty quickly I was able to establish some of what he was talking about. There were patients who had been on these terrible medical odysseys, who had developed horrible symptoms, went to specialist after specialist, and then finally realized their symptoms began at the point that they went and got a medication change at the pharmacy. Then it was interesting, there were medical societies in the US for specialties that work with drugs that require very special dosing. So neurologists, psychiatrists, endocrinologists, cardiologists, and some of those medical societies had actually issued alerts to their doctors to think about pharmaceutical shifts, changes between generics or from brand to generic if they see a sudden onset of symptoms. So it was like, okay, this is actually a problem that doctors are becoming aware of, right? So I did this story in Self magazine in 2009 about this. And I was really the first journalist to expose this quality problem with generics.
Right.
But, I was not very satisfied with that story because I kept thinking about Joe Graydon's question, what is wrong with the drugs? And it was like, okay, it doesn't tell me what's wrong with the drugs. It tells me that something may be wrong with the drugs, but what? So it was about a month after that story published, and I get this email from an anonymous source who was calling himself $4 refill, which is, of course, like what you'd pay if you go to Walgreens or something,
Right.
or Walmart, and you get a generic refill. So he basically says to me over email that if I want to figure out what the problem with the drugs are, I need to look at where they're being manufactured, which is in India and China. So I'm like, how am I going to do that? I'm an independent journalist in Brooklyn, no foreign desk, no anything.
No
Like I have
budget.
no foreign sources. I don't know anybody in India. I've never been there. I'm like, this is sort of impossible. But I'm like, well, I kept thinking about Joe Graydon's question. So I'm like, I feel I should try to figure this out. So I'm trying to figure this out. But while I'm trying to figure it out, I make this very clear decision, which is I'm going to become an expert at generic drug manufacturing. I'm going to learn everything I can about the manufacturing process. I'm going to learn everything about the FDA pathway. I'm going to visit laboratories and I'm going to see what I see. And in the course of doing that, 3 things happened. First thing was I go and visit a laboratory. It was called Celsus Laboratory in New Jersey. And I just asked, could I come see how they do stuff? They had an excellent reputation. So I'm following around the head of quality at this lab, and she's explaining to me how the testing works, et cetera. And then she says
Right.
to me, we ban whiteout throughout the facility. And I'm like, what does whiteout have to do with drug manufacturing? Like, what's the possible relationship? And then she explains that because data is sacrosanct, right? And that you use a comprehensive, fully transparent sort of process, and you have all your data available for scrutiny, and the FDA scrutinizes that when they come in. That is like your Rosetta Stone. You can't alter data. You can't conceal data.
Right.
And so whiteout is like a temptation for a criminal scheme of deleting or altering data.
Right.
So they ban whiteout. So I'm like, huh. Then I go down to the FDA, and that was back in the days where they were a little bit more welcoming of journalists. And I sit around this conference table with FDA officials, and in the room is the head of the Office of Generic Drugs. So I'm interviewing them, and I asked this data question. I was like, well, how do you evaluate the quality of a generic drug? And they say, oh, the manufacturing plants send us their data. And I'm like, okay. And then I'm like, do you do independent testing of the drugs? So he says no. And yeah, no independent testing of the drugs. And then he says the application process requires the ethical behavior of the applicant Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down.
Oh, wow.
And I am like, whoa, whoa. You're telling me that the FDA is running its generic drug approvals on an honor system, right?
Yeah.
That's what he
That's
was saying.
incredible.
I nearly fell off my chair.
Yeah.
So then
We'll
I
take
say
your
to
word
him,
for it.
Then I say to him, what if the applicant is not ethical?
Mhm.
I mean, that was the question.
For
Right.
sure.
And when I started reporting Bottle of Lies, the common wisdom, doctors, pharmacists, they all told me, oh yeah, generic drugs are the same because the requirements are the same. You know, that the generic drug applicant has to follow these requirements. And I'm like, I'm an investigative journalist. Obvious question, like, what if they don't?
Mhm.
Okay. The third thing that happened is I start hearing about this company I'd never heard of called Ranbaxy. Now, Ranbaxy was a household name in India. It is the biggest drug manufacturer in India. And I found out the Justice Department had an investigation of Ranbaxy into the question of whether they had fabricated or altered their quality data in some way. So now I'm like, this is beginning to make sense. Of course, as an investigative journalist, you have to follow the money. So then I found out there's this thing called first to file, which is this gold rush that's built into the generic drug manufacturing process. And I excavated this memo that the FDA had issued, which said, we're a little bit concerned about safety because we've got company representatives that are pitching tents in the FDA parking lot, and they're standing on lines for weeks at a time in the FDA parking lot. Then I found out companies were sending in stretch limos and with a team of people who would take turns sleeping and waiting online, all to be first to file, and that there had been fistfights that had broken out online and shoving matches with manufacturers shoving one another out of the way. So I'm like, okay, you've got this profit motive, you've got an honor system, you've got companies that are 7,000 miles away from FDA headquarters. I've got this guy, $4 refill, who's telling me to look in India and China. Now I am like seriously interested.
Wow.
No kidding.
Yeah. So I decided I have to figure out what happened inside Ranbaxy. And that brings us, Alex, to your question. What
Right.
happened inside of Ranbaxy? So we can pick up that.
Yeah. I mean,
What-
that's obviously there's a tremendous opportunity for moral hazard based on the circumstances that you've laid out there. The fact that there's this tremendous profit incentive and virtually no accountability other than, like you said, personal accountability with regards to the players and the manufacturer of these pharmaceutical products. And so go ahead, Dad. Sorry.
Catherine, from a chronological standpoint, what year is this when you're about to begin this pursuit?
Yeah, so I mean, I got my first tip in 2008, and by now, then I had my article in 2009, then I get my tip from $4 refill. So now we're at like 2010, right? And I'm really about to, start this sort of
Odyssey.
crazy long distance pursuit of
Eh,
Joe Braden's question. So at this point, I'm a contributor to Fortune magazine.
Okay.
And I start reporting the Ranbaxy story for Fortune magazine.
Okay.
And let me tell you, it took from my beginning that investigation till publication took about 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this reporting is not for impatient people,
Right. And
but
did it
it's
take a lot
very
of
good
convincing?
for obsessive people.
Like us, we are in that category. Did it take a lot of convincing at Fortune magazine to receive approval to pursue this to the extent that you did?
No, except look, nobody in the US at that point had ever heard of Ranbaxy. I mean, even though it was absolutely a giant in the Indian firmament, but obviously a question of quality at Ranbaxy had giant implications for US consumers. So at that point in time, it was the fastest growing generic drug maker in the US.
Katherine, you're beginning the story of Ranbaxy and the entire scene in India. Where does PEPFAR, the US government program, fit into all of this?
That's a really good question. So let me back up and say that I think one of the biggest headwinds that I faced in this investigation is, the sense that generics are essential, and it is true. Like every healthcare system relies on them. They are essential to public health around the world. They've done, maybe in the aggregate, way more good than bad. So the idea of investigating a quality question for generics was uncomfortable even for me. Politically, I'm all for generics. I want everybody to be able to afford medication they need.
Sure.
So it's not like I had some particular zeal or desire to target the generic drug industry, but I would say what kept me going was the sense that if a drug is not high quality, it's not going to work.
Mhm.
And there's an essential promise of democratizing access to pharmaceuticals and generics. And if you break that compact by selling substandard drugs for a profit motive, do I want to investigate your company? Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh,
Right.
yeah, I really do. So that is, that's what kept me going. Now, so Ranbaxy, they brought in two employees who are relevant to this story. Raj Kumar was a very high level, I think he was trained as a psychiatrist and a very high level employee from, where did he come from? Was it Eli Lilly? He came from one of the big branded companies.
Yeah.
And then they brought him in as the head of research and development, and Ranbaxy was growing fast. And then under him, they brought in a fellow named Dinesh Thakur, and he had come from Bristol Myers Squibb. And basically what they had brought him in to do was reconcile and organize this fast-growing pipeline of drugs, right? So Ranbaxy's making generics for many, many countries around the world. And each one is a different regulator, a different approval process. And so he was supposed to bring order to this research and development pipeline. He was a computer scientist, among other things. So Raj Kumar, and this was in 2005, 2004, 2005.
It was Mylan, wasn't it, that he was with?
No,
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 not Mylan.
no, not Mylan. He came from a branded company. So then there's a problem, which is the WHO goes in to inspect this HIV. I guess it was a contract research organization that was doing clinical testing for generics, and they were doing clinical testing for Ranbaxy. And the inspector uncovers this scheme whereby there's not like 100 patients they're testing, there's 10, and they're Xeroxing the results and making 10 look like 100. So they're circumventing the proper way of testing. And they send these findings to Ranbaxy, basically like, your contract research organization is committing fraud. This was in South Africa. And Raj Kumar gets on a plane and he goes over there. And he's on his way back, and his associate at the company, Ranbaxy, tells him like, well, it's not just the HIV drugs. It's kind of like other drugs. And he's like, what? And he's the guy for the company who's saying that the drugs are okay, right? He's like where the buck stops.
Mm-hmm.
So he calls Dinesh Thakur into his office and he's like, all right, you are going to drop everything that you are doing and you are going to investigate our company.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to delve into every portfolio, every application around the world and see, do we have any exposure here? is the data we're giving to regulators around the world different, somehow not reflective of the data that we have, the testing that we're doing, right? Are we faking our data?
Mm-hmm.
Dinesh Thakur then realizes that he had a 3-year-old boy who had been very sick with an ear infection, who had been taking Ranbaxy antibiotics and had not gotten better. And they switched it to a brand antibiotic, and the boy instantly recovered.
Hmm.
So Dinesh is like, what is going on?
Mm-hmm.
So he starts investigating the company, and he stumbles into Ranbaxy's open secret. Many employees in the company knew that not only was much of the data faked, but the level of fakery was reflective of the country the drugs were being sold to. So
Right.
the drugs for India, where no one checked the data, was all fake. It was just invented.
Right.
The drugs for Brazil, where all the data was faked, it was just invented. And the more regulated the market became, the more checking there was. But Dinesh Thakur estimated that for the most regulated markets, which was Europe, the US, and I guess to some extent Canada, or North America, it was maybe 50% faked.
Right.
So what Dinesh Thakur had uncovered was this global crime.
Incredible.
He puts together a PowerPoint, which Raj Kumar then shows to the board of directors. I obtained a copy of this PowerPoint, and I will tell you that in the pantheon of corporate documents that I've gotten in my career as an investigative journalist, I've never seen a document like this. It lays out very clearly that for 200 products in over 40 countries, those were submitted with data that was either totally fake, partially fake, somewhat fake.
The infamous self-assessment report, the SAR.
And you know what? I think your audience is interested in the fact Raj's bosses basically excoriated him because it's like, you start this process of self-assessment, you're going to create documents, you're not going to know where it's going to lead.
Right.
And you're creating exposure for the company. Now, arguably, the exposure came when they decided to fake data for drugs that they were selling all over the world.
Right.
So, but this self-assessment report lays out 200 drug products sold in over 40 countries, sold with fake data to support business needs.
Right.
Business needs being financial imperatives.
I'm picturing Jack Nicholson in geez, what's the name of the movie? When he says you can't handle the truth to Tom Cruise, like that's what I'm picturing in this
Yes.
boardroom.
A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men. Thank you. Like,
yes.
My goodness, the for him to drop that bombshell on them, and I'm sure there was probably not a whole lot of people who batted an eye, because they must have known.
They knew
what was going on.
So Raj Kumar presents this document to this silent boardroom, and then he basically makes clear the only ethical thing to do is withdraw all the drugs, come clean, tell the regulators, and retest the drugs.
Katherine, just to put a little bit of perspective on Raj and Dinesh, these are Indian nationals who early on in their lives moved to the US, became educated in the US, worked for US companies, and then went back to India. So they had a different ethical and moral compass than did the company in India.
They very much wanted to support the development, the financial, economic development of their homeland. But at the same time, you are right that they are trained corporate cultures that were quite distinct.
Right. And quick sidebar here, Katherine. Was their findings limited specifically or solely to the data and the trial, or were there also findings that were cause for concern when it came to cleanliness and health standards that were maintained within the manufacturing facilities themselves?
The falsification of data was across a wide range of categories, everything from how quickly a drug degraded to, level of toxins in the drugs, impurities, microbial standards. I mean,
Right.
it was a wide array of issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I seem to recall a portion in a passage in the book where you described the regulator going in and watching everybody get all dressed up in their gowns and whatnot, and they double gloved, and he looked at it and said, why are you putting on 2 layers of gloves? What exactly are you achieving? And then noticing on the inside of the door fingerprints, and looking at that and saying that doesn't add up, like that doesn't make sense. Was that at Ranbaxy or was that at another manufacturing
I know
facility?
exactly what you're talking about. I think that was at a different company, but
Okay.
yes, they left behind clues that the double gloves were just for show, and in fact, they had hands on that knob, ungloved, clearly.
And just reading that and even discussing it here today, it sends chills up and down my spine thinking about what actually goes on and versus what is portrayed to us, and through the whether it's the media or through our just understanding of the industry, and we accept the level of safety and the standards that are utilized are up to what we would expect them to be, and in fact in many cases they are not.
Yeah. So Raj Kumar basically makes his position clear to the board that they have only one choice, which is to withdraw these drugs from the marketplace and come clean with the regulators. And the board basically says, we're going to bury this. We want the computer on which this document was created destroyed. We want copies of the document destroyed. So Raj Kumar has no choice. He leaves the company. That leaves Dinesh Thakur completely exposed, with no protection. And then the company sends in auditors to start combing through the books of his department, and they plant porn on his computer.
This is the part that's hilarious. It's okay to poison half the planet, but you can't watch porn on your corporate computer.
Right. And so he has no choice. He's forced out of the company. And he's just leaves. He tries to put it behind him. He's got a young family. He's got 2 kids, wife that he's moved from the US. He's terrified because people who expose corporate secrets in India do not fare well typically. Many are murdered. There are no whistleblower protections, but he can't live with himself. And he keeps thinking about, the poorest of poorest patients in Africa and elsewhere who are getting compromised HIV drugs. He knows they're bad.
Mm-hmm.
So he decides he's going to pose as he's a highly educated, perfect English, but he decides he's going to pose as a lowly bench scientist. And he creates a email account, and he starts sending emails to regulators around the world, to Anvisa in Brazil, to COFEPRIS in Mexico, to European regulators, FDA, WHO, and he starts telling them what's going on, and nobody pays any attention. And finally, he just so frustrated, August of 2005, he writes directly to the FDA commissioner, perfect English, doesn't identify himself, and says, this is what's going on in Ranbaxy. I plead with you to put a stop to this crime. And that is what gets him in dialogue with the FDA and begins the process of his becoming an official whistleblower.
Right.
That leads to an 8-year FDA investigation. That was the investigation I first learned about when I learned about Ranbaxy. And the FDA, after an 8-year investigation, during which the FDA gives Ranbaxy approval after approval to launch new drug products, including generic Lipitor, the first to file in the US.
Incredible.
While they're criminally investigating the company, and they have this self-assessment report, and they know the company is saturated with crime, Approval after approval.
So how does that happen?
How does that happen? It's mind-boggling. Honestly, if I tried to explain to you how it happened, we'd be here for a year. It's
Incomprehensible.
crazy.
Silos. They're operating in independent silos.
Yeah, they're friendly to industry. They're operating in silos. The criminal investigators at the FDA are not being heard.
So,
You
Catherine, I
know,
got to ask you, like, do your findings through this book make you naturally more skeptical about anything that goes through that approval process now, that FDA approval process? Not to say that everyone in the FDA is bad and that it is that they're intentionally trying to mislead or harm people, but are you now naturally more skeptical about anything that comes from the pharmaceutical industry and flows through the FDA?
I don't know if I would say more skeptical because I am by nature skeptical. I mean, which is why I do what I do. And Bottle of Lies is my second book and not my first rodeo. So I don't know that I would say I am more skeptical. Um, you know, but there are huge political and financial considerations. I mean, the FDA is hauled in front of Congress and they want to report how many generic drugs they approved, right? Because Americans cannot afford their drugs, and we don't have common sense drug price regulation, price regulation. So they're facing a political imperative to approve these drugs. And then the problem is if their investigators walk into a plant and they find terrible conditions and they take that plant offline and they halt imports, what's going to happen in the US? We're going to have drug shortages. We're going to have price increases, right? So they're like, got to keep this whole ship running. And the only thing that's going to stop them is litigation, people like me, or like a giant pile of dead bodies. I mean, that's really the truth. That's how it rolls.
Catherine, tell us what the role of former President Bill Clinton was in Ranbaxy's story.
So Bill Clinton he had a very special relationship with India. And he was really the person that set the Indian generic drug industry sort of on its path towards being the world's pharmacy. He visited Ranbaxy, he visited a number of Indian drug companies and basically promoted the idea that US taxpayers could pay for cheap Indian generics that would go to Africa. Now that idea was crystallized by actually George Bush in a program called PEPFAR, which is a brilliant idea. It's truly the concept of a globalized world whereby we as a wealthy country can pay for Indian generics that will treat HIV patients in Africa. Then what happened was, well, how do we know we can't use taxpayer money to send substandard drugs? So we're going to get these drugs tested, in theory, and approved, regulated, overseen by the FDA. And then, of course, a light bulb went off. Hey, if our FDA is saying that these drugs are okay and cleared for African patients, why can't they be cleared for US patients? And that's how this whole revolution began.
You talk about in your book the Valentine's Day Massacre. Please elaborate.
So basically, Dinesh Thakur had brought to the FDA's attention this idea that Ranbaxy was saturated with fraud. Now, the problem, with this globalized pharmaceutical arrangement is that we don't have US attorneys in India, right? We don't have prosecutors there. We can't serve search warrants there. We can't knock down doors there. What we can do is we can send inspectors into manufacturing plants there. The other thing we can do is we can raid corporate headquarters in the US, where we do have US attorneys.
Right.
So the FDA got a search warrant to go and search Ranbaxy's Princeton, New Jersey headquarters. And it was an amazing moment. You've got these guys on a snowy Valentine's Day. You had these FDA Office of Criminal Investigation agents with guns on their hips raiding Ranbaxy's corporate headquarters. At first, they thought it was an immigration raid. They step away from their desks. And as part of that raid, the FDA gets a hold of a document, and the cover page is, "Do not share this with FDA."
Oh.
And it is a report about how they've pushed through this acne drug, Sotret, Accutane. It's the generic of Accutane, based on completely fraudulent data. So that was one of the important pieces of information that the FDA extracted from that raid in New Jersey.
My God. Somebody who took Accutane as well as some other derivations prior to actually getting on the Accutane and knowing that they didn't work until I got on Accutane itself. And again, like my dad said, it makes you wonder what exactly I was putting in my body.
So Catherine's talking about the FDA starting to come down on Ranbaxy, and this brings to mind the super FDA investigator Peter
Baker.
Peter Baker, thank you. Peter Baker, tell us about Peter Baker and how he changed the culture at the FDA and in the process of investigating these Indian manufacturers.
Yeah. So again, to just tell this part of it, I'll just step back and talk a little bit about my investigation. So
okay.
In 2013, Ranbaxy finally pleaded guilty to 7 felony counts of fabricating, altering data in a Maryland courtroom. And 2 days after they plead guilty, finally my article runs in Fortune magazine. And
right.
It's a 10,000 word article about the inside story of what happened at Ranbaxy.
Right.
I tell the story about Ranbaxy. I tell the story about Dinesh Thakur, and he is awarded a whistleblower award of about $38 million for his role in bringing this to light. And I should say, if anybody thinks that what he went through is easy, I mean, he spent years as a completely secret whistleblower, became estranged from his family, risked his life. His whole life was torn apart.
You did an excellent job in your book explaining what this man went through in the course of this investigation, and the stress was palpable as you're reading the book. So yeah, you did a really good job. And anyway, I'll let you finish.
Thank you. So after that article came out, and it was about maybe a few months after that article came out, I got another anonymous email from somebody new, a news source. And this was an FDA consultant. This person said to me, "You need to look into what I call fast drugs." And the consultant explained, so you have fast fashion, you have fast food. So let's say fast fashion, cheap clothing lines. You as a consumer can go in and get some snazzy looking clothes at cut rate. We all know what that means, right? It's made in a sweatshop overseas. Sadly, workers was in suboptimal conditions. FDA consultant was explaining to me there is the equivalent of pharmaceutical sweatshops overseas.
Wow.
Unclean, suboptimal conditions. And the only defense we have against those pharmaceutical sweatshops and their low quality ingredients are FDA inspectors. So now I'm thinking, I'm still trying to, so I'm 5 years in, and I'm still trying to answer Joe Graydon's question, what is wrong with the drugs?
Mhm.
Now I figured out, I know what's wrong with Ranbaxy's drugs because they faked all their data. But
Right.
I have this question, is Ranbaxy just this outlier? Or is there something about the generic drug industry that they're just the tip of the iceberg and this is how it works? So I'm like, I got to answer that question in order to answer Joe Graydon's question of what is wrong with the drugs. So I start trying to report out the life of FDA inspectors who go overseas. And I discover this incredible thing, which is here in the US, FDA inspectors show up unannounced. They stay as long as they want. Nobody knows they're coming. But in the US, they're calling up 2 months in advance saying, can we come on such and such a date? They become the invited guest of the pharmaceutical plant. Those plants send luxury cars to pick up the inspectors. They take them to hotel rooms where they upgrade their hotels. They even, get this, bug the hotel rooms.
This is in India.
Yeah, listen to
Mhm.
their conversations.
Wow.
Poison the inspectors with tainted water because they know that if those inspectors only have 4 inspectional days, 5 inspectional days, they can knock off 2 of those days if they get sick.
Hmm.
So they were
Holy cow.
giving them tap water. Like
Oh my
they would have bottles of water, they'd fill them with tap water, they'd seal them up and give them, the inspectors would get sick in their luxury suites. They were taking them to the Taj Mahal on tourist junkets. I mean, it was insane what was going on, right? So these plants were completely cleaning up the premises, right? They were getting rid of monkeys, snakes, pigeons. So Peter Baker, he's a young guy, very computer savvy. He shows up at these plants. They know he's coming. They give him the dog and pony show. Then he says, as is his right, I want to look inside your computers. He doesn't say, print out data for me. He says he's looking in the computers. What he finds in plant after plant is they have subterranean testing programs. They pre-test the drugs. They figure out whether they're going to meet specifications. If they won't meet specifications, they alter the testing parameters so the drugs pass. Then they delete all the evidence of this pre-testing that they've done. And he found the metadata in plant after plant pointing to this pre-testing scheme. So basically, and he was having, his life was threatened. They threatened him. They followed him. They bugged his hotel room. They gave him tainted water. And they knew if Peter Baker shows up in your plant, you're going to be taken offline and it's going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. So they went to these elaborate lengths to deceive him. In most cases, they couldn't. So it turned out, and I can't remember what the exact number it is, but it's like in 7/8 of the plants that he went to in India and China, he found evidence of this. So that it was through my reporting on Peter Baker and what he uncovered that I began to be satisfied that I had an answer to Joe Graydon's question, what is wrong with the drugs? That the prevalence of this, of fabricating data, was so widespread. Once I uncovered what Peter Baker had found, and I realized the inspectors from FDA who are actually doing their jobs are walking in and they're finding horrible conditions. So there were like one of the most shocking things, 2 aseptic plants in India that were supposed to be operating with perfect sterilization procedures, doing all sorts of microbial testing, surfaces, water. Baker and his colleagues discovered they weren't testing anything. There were all the vials, there were all the test results, and there were no tests run. All the testing data, the microbial testing data, was fabricated. So one of the ways that they figured this out is they did a pilot program. and they did no notice and short notice inspections. In other words, they stopped giving 2 months of advance notice. Once they did that, the rate of findings of official action indicated, which is the worst findings, right? That official action indicated means not please fix this. It means emergency. If this doesn't get fixed, we're taking you offline now.
Mhm.
The rate of official action indicated findings went up about 60%.
I was just going to ask you, Catherine. So, what ultimately becomes of Ranbaxy and their CEO Malvinder Singh? How does this company, this completely flawed and completely morally bankrupt organization, do they stop functioning? Do they get shut down? What happens to them?
This is unfortunately a very dark tale, because once Malvinder Singh and his brother, who own Ranbaxy and inherited it from their grandfather, once they realize that the FBI is onto them and that they're under criminal investigation by the U.S. Justice Department, what they do is put themselves up for sale. And a Japanese company, Daiichi Sankyo, decides, hey, we want a footprint in all these underserved markets. This is a great opportunity for us. Their lawyers get rolled by the Singh brothers, right? The Singh brothers conceal all this evidence of this criminal investigation, and they sell themselves for $2 billion to
Wow.
Daiichi Sankyo. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. So they're laughing all the way to the bank. And it's not long after this sale goes through that Ranbaxy is hit with these criminal, these felony counts. That there's ultimately a negotiated settlement, $500 million to settle the Justice Department claims. And guess who's on the hook for it? Daiichi
Daiichi.
Sankyo. So then Daiichi Sankyo, to redeem itself for shareholders, they sue the Singh brothers and Ranbaxy, and so begins this new odyssey of litigation. I mean, the end result is that Ranbaxy ceases to exist as an international company. And I have to say, I think that the chapters on how the Singh brothers deceive that very nice, Japanese company is sort of like a reverse Godzilla movie.
Yeah.
It is a sad story.
Now they did get some money back, did they not?
Yeah, they did. There was ultimately a settlement, but I mean, it's a very bitter chapter, and it's a very dark chapter for Indian pharma.
Right. Is there an appendix to this story since 2019? Has the industry improved at all? And does the US still import generics from India and China to this day?
Well, I would like to tell you that I made it all better. Unfortunately, that is not true. So what happened was, there were a number of congressional hearings after my book came out. The FDA announced, okay, we're not going to be the invited guests of these pharmaceutical companies anymore. We're going to make our own travel arrangements, right?
Mhm.
And stay on our own dime in India and not take the trips to the Taj Mahal anymore. So it looked like things were beginning to turn around. Then COVID struck, and the FDA had to cancel all of its overseas inspections. And I will not forget the press release that the FDA sent out saying, don't worry, even though we can't go in person, the companies will be submitting data we will be using to review the quality of the drugs, and it's all good.
Here
Is
we
this
go all over
2005 again?
Yeah.
Oh my
So,
God.
so now start up again in 2023, they start going back to these companies that they haven't set foot in, these manufacturing plants they haven't set foot in 3 years, and lo and behold, it is a total disaster. So
Wow.
there's company after company where they are finding terrible, terrible things.
And I'm sure they
we
told
are,
everyone this time it'll be different.
yeah,
This time they'll be okay.
Yeah.
Just to shed some light for our Canadian listeners, here in Canada, I was looking up the sources of generic manufacturers that we're utilizing here. We are here in Canada utilizing some Indian and some Chinese generic drugs. They are a small percentage, I think 5% of the overall supply. But nonetheless, we are exposed here in Canada as well. And Katherine, what are you working on right now?
I was busy promoting Bottle of Lies when COVID struck. And that is when I got a call from Vanity Fair to come and cover COVID for them. So I have been at Vanity Fair since, I guess it was March of 2020. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Covering COVID for them. And that's where I am to this day. So I'm doing all kinds of investigative science, medicine, healthcare.
So when you say you're covering COVID, what exactly are you covering?
Well, I have been deep into the reporting on the very contested question of where COVID originated.
Right. Okay.
And, the question of whether it came from a lab or whether it came from a natural origin in a market.
Right.
And you may know our intelligence agencies are divided on that question.
Right.
Yes.
So it is far from resolved, but I will say this. After spending 10 years investigating Chinese and Indian manufacturing plants and seeing the incredible things that can go wrong, the state of regulation, I understood very quickly that a lab origin was a possibility.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, wow. Cliffhanger until next time, and we hear more from you. Where can people interested go to learn about what work you're doing right now?
Yeah. So, I recommend you can get on my mailing list at katherineeban.com is my website. You can sign up for my mailing list there.
Excellent.
You can follow me on Twitter, now known as X, at Katherine Eban. That's where I'm sort of most active. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there.
Katherine, you are a remarkable individual, an incredible investigative reporter, an exceptional writer. Your book was one of my favorite books of all time. As I said, when I was reading it, I could not put it down. If you were in the fiction space, I'm not sure what genre you would be under, but it would be a genre that to me would be like a spy thriller. Just phenomenal. We really wish to thank you for taking your time and spending it with us this afternoon and telling us all about Bottle of Lies. We encourage everyone who's listening to this to run out and pick up the book from their local bookstore or order it through Amazon or whichever way you buy your books.
Thank you very much again, Katherine. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to speak with you. I enjoyed our conversation a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bill, take it away.
Well, I don't want to take it away because I've got to tell you, I've been sitting here for the last hour and a half, completely riveted. Katherine, first of all, thank you for your work. Really do appreciate the fact that you put so much effort, commitment, and integrity into what you're doing, and thank you for that. Second, it's not a hollow thing. I went and bought the book while we were having the conversation. So I would urge your listeners to go out and buy this book as well. Do it. And the other thing you could do that doesn't cost you any money is you get to subscribe for this podcast. That way you don't, won't miss another episode of it, and you won't have to worry about where or when you heard it because you'll get it delivered to you immediately. But before we go, we know how to reach Katherine. Guys, how do we get a hold of y'all? What do we need to do if we want to reach out and have a further conversation with MedWealth Financial?
Absolutely, Bill. They can go to our website, which is medwealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.